We were delighted to have Rabbi Rosen come down all the way from Evanston, Illinois, like 3 hours north, and talk to us about the dissent amongst in the Jewish community on the Israel-Palestine conflict. So just a little bit about Rabbi Rosen. Although he has drawn a crowd, so I'm assuming you guys know who he is. But for formality's sake, we'll continue on. He serves a congregation in Evanston, Illinois. He's currently the co-chair of Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council. He's also served as the president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, and he's also served on the board of the Rabbis for Human Rights in North America. Along with this, he's also been very popular for his writings in his personal blog, Shalom Rav, and he's also been a contributor to the Huffington Post, Chicago Tribune, and a number of other media outlets. In 2008, he was honored by Newsweek as one of the top 25 pulpit rabbis in North America, or I guess actually in America. And his book, Wrestling in the Daylight, A Rabbi's Path to Palestinian Solidarity, was published in 2012 by Just World Books. So obviously, his credentials are impeccable, and we're delighted to have him in Champaign-Urbana. It takes a lot of effort to come down here, so we're very glad to see you all here. So I guess before we proceed, I don't want to take too much of his time. We'll just discuss the format of this lecture. So he's going to be delivering a lecture up to from 30 minutes up to however long he'd like. So we're at the mercy of his will. And that's going to be followed by question and answer. So we do request that if there are any questions or answers, you guys hold it off till the discussion portion, which is directly after the lecture. And I really do hope you guys enjoy it. Without further ado, let's give him a champagne welcome.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. It was a gorgeous drive, actually, down to Champaign. It was not a problem at all. And I'm sort of appalled to say this. Oh, wait. I'll talk about it.
Okay.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah.
So far.
Yeah, if I start to wane, just let me know. I'm a little bit appalled to say I've lived in the Chicago area for about over 16 years, and I've never made it to the University of Illinois until now, so thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm hoping this is just the first of many. I want to thank SJP and CARE, and especially Ahmed, for inviting me. Ahmed is he's a keeper, by the way. Where'd he go? He has, to my mind, one of the most important qualities of an organizer, and that is he's relentless. He kept after me, kept in touch with me over email, and even when various parts of this program changed, he really worked hard to make this happen, and I really appreciate that. It's in the room here to say this. Oh, there you are. Yes, thank you. So, to me, a lot of the work I do in this area is about building relationships, and that for me is the most primary aspect of why I'm here, and that is to get to know you, to have conversation, and to be part of a very exciting and fast-growing movement. So, I was asked to speak about the dissent and diversity in the Jewish community on the issue of Israel-Palestine, and I think that's an excellent topic to be talking about, because I do think there's something going on in my community on this issue. I think we're in the midst, I think, of a very real paradigm shift. And I think it's important to shine a light on it and to talk about it and to even derive lessons for it going forward, especially for those of us who are part of this movement, because I think the movement for justice for Palestinians is rapidly gaining Jewish adherents. And that's always been the case, but I think even more so, people who were, like myself, previously not part of this community, previously part of the Zionist Jewish establishment community, are starting to reconsider, or at the very least, starting to say we need to be talking about this within the Jewish community. And previously, even the very mention of talking about things like anti-Zionism, talking about a one-state solution rather than a two-state solution, were just considered completely beyond the pale. In fact, I'm old enough to remember even when talking about a two-state solution was considered an anathema. And we've seen how that has shifted. Now that's the establishment position. So there is something going on, and I think it's worth unpacking and talking about. What I'd like to do, as Ahmed said, I'll talk until I feel like I'm talked out, or you feel I'm talked out. 20 to 30 minutes maybe. I'd like to say a little bit about my own story, how I came to this work from in some ways from a very unlikely place. And then I'd like to offer a few thoughts just generally about what's going on in the Jewish community, a little bit of a history of the role of Zionism in the Jewish community and the way the paradigm is shifting, the way the pendulum is starting to swing back in another direction. And then we'll open it up. I think the most important thing for me is to hear from you and for us to engage in conversation. So just a little bit of a personal history. I have a congregation in Evanston. It's a fairly large congregation, about 530 households belong. And I've been a congregational rabbi since 1992. I've always served congregations. This one has been the longest that I've ever served, a little over 16 years. And I come from a nice Jewish middle-class family, and I grew up in Los Angeles, and Israel and Zionism were always part of the mix, as it is for many middle-class American Jewish families. Israel is just part and parcel of the Jewish identity. It was something I never really questioned. I have family in Israel, my father's side. I first visited Israel when I was 7 or 8, I think. I'm always identified with Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people and the Jewish state in the international arena. I've visited Israel 4 times that I can count at this point. I spent a little over 2 years at one point when I took time off from college and considered actually moving to Israel. So Israel has always been an integral part of my identity. And Israel, as I look back, I think represents something very compelling for many Americans. The Israel narrative is a powerful narrative. It's a redemptive story when you think about it. It's the story of a persecuted people living throughout the diaspora, being driven from country to country, then going through the horrors of the Holocaust, and finally establishing a Jewish state, a sovereign Jewish political state in their ancient homeland, out of the ashes of the Holocaust. There's a real power in this narrative. It's simple but powerful, and even for Jews who don't identify as religious, secular Jews, it has what I like to say is it has a religious kind of power for them. And that's something I think it's important to understand about the role of Israel in Jewish life. That it plays on a lot of our hot button identity issues of persecution, issues of being powerless, issue of anti-Semitism and feelings of vulnerability in the world. And it represents empowerment after centuries of disempowerment. And that narrative certainly was part of my identity, there's no question. I identified very strongly with the liberal Zionist wing of the Zionist movement. I was very active in the peace movement in Shalom Achshav and Peace Now, and when I became a rabbi, I was a strong proponent of the two-state solution, along the lines of what you would see J Street doing today, for instance. I would also say, however, that looking back, it was never a complete advocacy of the Zionist position. I think I always had these little nagging voices in the back of my head that I think I did a pretty good job of sort of putting aside, putting in a little box and setting them aside. Looking back, I may describe them very well. I've always been progressive and liberal. I come from a very progressive liberal family, and I'm sure you might be familiar with this phenomenon in the Jewish world that in America, Jews tend to be on the, generally speaking, on the liberal side of the political spectrum, and there's this phenomenon called PEP. Is anyone familiar with PEP? Progressive Except for Palestine. Every once in a while I would stop to think, that here I am identifying so powerfully with this over-militarized nation that is in many ways an arm of American militarism in the Middle East. I have no problem protesting American militarism anywhere else in the world, but somehow when it comes to Israel, Israel gets a pass, and more than a pass. I'm very supportive of this militarism. And I think about that for a while and then sort of set it aside. There were other nagging doubts I had as well. When it came to Zionism in particular, one thing that I could never quite square was this notion of a Jewish state, the identity of which was predicated on having a demographically Jewish majority in historic Palestine. In order to have a Jewish state, you need to have a majority of Jews. And even as a liberal Zionist, as a progressive Zionist, you will hear, and I would say these things myself, that the reason we needed a two-state solution was not necessarily for humanitarian reasons or for out of a sense of compassion for Palestinians, but it was because there was a threat to the Jewishness of Israel. Right? There was the Palestinian birth rate represented a demographic threat, quote unquote, to the Jewish state, and you still hear that over and over today. And those terms like that we need an ethnic majority of Jews to have a Jewish state. And every once in a while I stop to think, Palestinians or non-Jews in general are a demographic threat to Israel. I mean, if we, as an American, if I talked about, a certain ethnic group in my country as a demographic threat to the American character of my country, that would be actually pretty racist. And yet, we could say that so easily when it came to this ethnic nationalism that Zionism represented. And I was never able to sort of square that circle, but again, I would sort of take those voices and put them off to the side. To make a long story short, after I was ordained as a rabbi, those voices got louder and louder, and I basically dealt with them through avoidance. I just took on other issues besides Israel and talked about other issues besides Israel. There was too much anguish or too much doubt. I went on a trip, actually, in early 2008, for the first time where I really, really saw the West Bank up close. I went to Hebron and saw parts of the city in which Palestine, which used to be a center of Palestinian life, Shahada Street, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is now off limits to Palestinians, literally cleansed of Palestinians. Shops that are boarded up with anti-Palestinian graffiti, Palestinians who can't even leave their front doors because the street in front of their house is for Jews only. I went to all kinds of places and saw up close the real horror of the occupation and of what I believe now that Zionism has wrought. And the trip, interestingly enough, was sponsored by Meretz, which is a progressive Israeli party in Israel, and American Friends of Meretz, and also Rit Tzedek B'Shalom, which was one of the early forerunners of J Street. And the purpose of that trip was to show us this horrible stuff that's going on in the occupied territories so that we would recommit all the more to the peace process, to a two-state solution. But the effect it had on me was, what two-state solution? I mean, how can we possibly come up with a two-state solution given what I'm seeing here on the ground? I mean, I saw one state. I saw Jewish roads leading to Jewish settlements and small little cantons or bandstands of Palestinians that were disconnected from one another, going through all of these checkpoints. Made it very clear that I didn't see that the peace process was about anything resembling a viable Palestinian state. So it had the effect on me of, instead of redoubling my effort toward the peace process, to sort of pushing me in the other direction. Anyways, at the end of that year, December 2008 was Operation Cast Lead, again, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Israel's military offensive against Gaza. And that was what finally tore it for me, and where I made a very sort of highly publicized break with my liberal Zionism. I had been writing a blog since 2006 and started blogging very candidly about what was going on, which I considered to be a war crime and an outrage, and basically saying I can't support this anymore. And my first blog post I just wrote without really even thinking about fallout. It was just sort of a gut conscience-based act, and I knew there was going to be huge fallout. And that is exactly what happened. But what was interesting to me is that even though it raised all kinds of dust inside my congregation, certainly, I had been 10 years as the rabbi of this congregation at that point. And I think probably any other congregation probably would have hand my ass on the spot. They, to their credit, said, "Wow, okay, this, I was getting all kinds of attention both from members of my congregation and also people in the general community who were writing to the leaders of my congregation saying, what the hell is your rabbi saying? What is he doing? This isn't, the rabbi we hired, etc." And the leadership responded by saying, "Okay, well, this is creating a lot of pain for people in our congregation. On the other hand, this is the rabbi who's doing what rabbis should do, which is speak their conscience on these kinds of issues. And so we said, let's work this out. Let's figure out how we're going to make this work." And I'm very heartened to say it's now 2014, and I'm still the rabbi of my congregation. And I've since that time, I've gone on 2 trips where I've taken members of my congregation to the West Bank, where we've stayed in Palestinian refugee camps, where I've taken them to the places that I had seen. On this last October, we went to the village of Dissent, which I'm sure many of you know is one of the centers of the popular resistance movement in the West Bank, and we participated in the Friday demonstration there. And it's not that every member of my congregation agrees with my political position. There's a small number who love what I'm doing. There's a small number on the other end who everything I say on this issue drives them crazy. And then there's a middle section of folks who they may agree, they may disagree, they may not know a lot about it, but they're open to learning and understand that this is what I'm doing out of my own conscience. And I think the fact that I can still remain the rabbi of this congregation, and I've since signed another contract with them, so I intend to be there a long time. This is my home, the Jewish community is my home, gives me a great deal of hope that in the Jewish community at large, these kinds of ideas can not only be tolerated, but accepted as part of the normal discourse of the Jewish community. I want to back up and say a little bit about the history of this issue in the Jewish community. It used to be, once upon a time, that Zionism was itself a dissident movement in Jewish life. It's almost impossible to imagine that today, because Zionism is so much thoroughly ingrained in the American Jewish establishment mentality. But when the Zionist movement started in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, it was a political movement that was considered very, very radical for its time, and actually kind of crazy. And there were many quarters of the Jewish community that did not believe that Zionism was a valid movement for the Jewish community. In fact, the Reform movement, one of the largest American Jewish denominations at that time, at their Pittsburgh platform, a very famous statement of Reformed Jewish values, disavowed Zionism and said that Jews are not about creating a nation state in the Middle East, but it was a very universal notion in early American Reform Judaism, that the world is our home, the diaspora is our home. We want to be loyal subjects of whatever country we live in. And in fact, that's what Jews have always done. Judaism as we know it was a diaspora-based religion. Judaism as we know it emerged after the destruction of the temple, after Jews left the land of Israel. And Judaism as we know it was really a system for living in the diaspora. We didn't have the temple anymore. We were not allowed in Jerusalem anymore. And the rabbis who really formed the foundation of Jewish tradition said, that's okay. God doesn't live in the temple in Jerusalem. God lives in the world. And we can find God wherever we go. And that was what allowed Judaism, that was the genius that allowed Judaism to survive. And for thousands of years of Jewish history, the rabbis were prohibited very, very strongly, actually, the notion of going back to Israel and forming a third Jewish commonwealth. You can look in the Talmud and there's very, very strong statements about forcing God's hand, quote unquote. Now when the Messiah comes, at the end of days, there will be a return to the land. But until that happens in this world, we don't ourselves take it upon ourselves to create a Jewish nation state, but rather we see the world as our home, and we remain citizens of whatever country we happen to live in. And that was the case up until the 19th century when Zionism was founded. And so Zionism was one of many different movements of Jewish modernity. The world was changing very, very quickly at this time. After the emancipation of Jews in Western Europe, there were all kinds of different movements that were trying to create a new kind of Judaism in the modern world. And Zionism was only one of them. Reform Judaism was another. There were Buddhist Jews, there were secular, there were communist Jews. All of these movements were, in a way, sort of dissident movements in Jewish life, and Zionism was one of them. I think that slowly changed over time, and in particular after the Holocaust was really when Zionism started to move fairly quickly from being a small minority movement into the mainstream, and began to really gain international support, international political support. There is a very interesting book actually that was just published. Are people familiar with the book Genesis by John Judas? Who was one of the editors of New Republic magazine, who I have only read the reviews of it, but I'm very eager to read the book, that shows that actually President Truman, who was, I think, conventionally been thought of as always very supportive of the Zionist movement, was actually not at all convinced that an exclusively Jewish state in historic Palestine was a good idea at all. And he was originally supportive of a binational state, of a state made up of its citizens of Jews and Arabs in Palestine. And it was only really through the pressure from both the sort of the neo-Jewish, neo-Israeli government, which was just burgeoning at that time, and also pro-Zionist supporters of the Jewish community in the United States that really pushed him to that position. And so, at any rate, after the Holocaust was really when Zionism started to move into the mainstream. And I would say that after '67 is what sealed the deal, after the Six-Day War, after this very quick, sort of lightning-fast conquest of the West Bank and Gaza. And there was this sort of euphoric effect on American Jews that even the secular Jews who weren't necessarily God-fearing folk, saw that there was some kind of redemptive something going on, that this small Jewish nation was returning to their home, their mythic ancient home in the land of Israel. Since '67, I think Zionism has been at the center of Jewish life, and that was certainly the world, as I told you, that I grew up in. However, in many ways, I think the anti-Zionist position moved into where the Zionist position was before. It was a dissident position. Within the Zionist movement, actually, before the establishment of the state, there were people who identified as Zionists who supported a binational state. There was one of the founders of Hebrew University, Rabbi Judah Magnus. If you haven't heard of him, he's someone I highly recommend you learn about. Magnus, M-A-G-N-E-S, was a Reform rabbi from the United States who moved to Israel, he was the first president of Hebrew University, and was also a very active member of a group called Brit Shalom, which, along with some other very high-profile Jewish figures like Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt, who was a prominent German Jewish journalist, were strong. So they considered themselves part of the Zionist movement, but they were advocates of a binational state and believed that creating an exclusively Jewish state would be basically a recipe for constant war. And up until the very day before the establishment or the acceptance of the partition plan in November of 1947, they were strongly advocating we can still turn back, it's not too late. I was recently in Los Angeles visiting a dear friend of mine who is a rabbi, a Reform rabbi, who's now in his 90s, Leonard Gehrman, who was one of the most courageous congregational rabbis I've ever met. He is a self-described pacifist. He is at the forefront of Palestinian solidarity activism in his congregation, leading that congregation in LA for many, many years. And he's my role model because he was able to stay there for 37 years. He spoke with Arafat twice. He spoke with Abu Jihad. This was in the 80s when such a thing would be just, unheard of in the Jewish community. At any rate, I was chatting with him just a few weeks ago, and he told me that he was in Israel in 1947 or 48, but he was in Palestine, actually, I should say. And he was studying at Hebrew University, and he studied with Judah Magnus. And I said, "You studied with Judah Magnus?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "In fact, I remember visiting him the day after the partition plan was accepted by the UN, and he was listening to the report on the radio with tears running down his face because he knew what was about to happen. And in fact, we're seeing what has happened. We've seen basically what Magnus and others like him. Hannah Arendt, for instance, wrote a very powerful essay saying there's still time, where she was saying, if we do this, we're going to create a Jewish Sparta, she called it, in the Middle East. That's going to become an over-militarized state that's going to be in a constant state of war. She wrote this in early 1948. And they were part of the Zionist movement, these people. Since that time, today, I think people like them would be considered anti-Zionists, which is interesting. I think we can see how that pendulum swings back and forth. But it still emerges, I would say, out of a very deeply held Jewish as well as universalist value system, which believes in peace and believes in justice and believes in brotherhood and sisterhood, and opposes war. So that point of view has always been around in the Jewish community. It's now a dissident, I would say, a minority view, and it's one that I've moved to myself, but it's growing. And I think it has to do with many, many things. There's many reasons for that. Often mentioned, I'm part of an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with JVP. It grew by leaps and bounds right around the time I started being involved in it, around the time of Operation Cast Lead. That incredibly tragic event, I think, caused many of us to really, really look very, very, many of us in the Jewish community, to look very, very carefully at some of the assumptions that we held about Israel previously. And Jewish Voice for Peace really gave us an institutional address in the Jewish world to advocate for a just peace for Jews and Palestinians in historic Palestine. And JVP today is very active in many ways. We, in fact, involved in different BDS campaigns. We're a home for Jews who are pursuing a rights-based approach to the crisis. In other words, unlike a group like J Street, for instance, which is trying to solve the crisis politically through advocacy for a two-state solution, JVP does not specifically talk about any one kind of political solution to the conflict. Rather, we're focusing on rights. That whatever the political solution, it needs to be one that ensures human rights, full civil rights, full equality, full equity for all who live in the land, Jewish or non-Jewish alike. And so there are some in JVP who still who consider themselves Zionists. There are some who consider themselves anti-Zionists. There are some who believe in a two-state solution, not necessarily the one that's being proposed currently in the peace process, but a two-state solution that would allow for full rights for everybody on both sides of the Green Line. And there are others who advocate a one-state solution, a state of all its citizens. But to me, why JVP is such an important institution in the Jewish world, it's really the first time in many years to have such a large organization that is advocating clearly that this is a home for whether you're Zionist, whether you're not Zionist. There's no litmus test for being Jewish and advocating for human rights for all. And there have been attempts at creating Jewish organizations like this in the past. In the late 60s, there was an organization called Bray Ra that existed very, very briefly before it was basically squashed by the Jewish establishment. There was another in the early 80s attempt called the Jewish Agenda, which also had a very short life. And I think, frankly, the reason these attempts did not work was because the time just wasn't right for them. I think we're in the midst of this paradigm shift where many Jews of my age are reconsidering our assumptions, as I said before, but also, maybe even more critically, there's a new younger generation that aren't growing up with these assumptions. They're not being raised with the narrative that I referred to at the beginning of my talk. The Israel they see is not this redemptive, miraculous, David against Goliath nation that is providing a safe haven for the Jewish people after centuries of persecution. They're growing up with a heavily militarized state that's basically a garrison state in the Middle East that's building bigger and higher walls, literally, between itself and Palestinians and the outside world. And they resent, I meet these Jews all the time, in my congregation and in my community. They resent being told that they have to be a Zionist in order to be a member of the Jewish community, or that they have to toe a certain political line on Israel in order to be able to participate. And I'll end with this. There's one, I think, final bellwether that I think, an important bellwether, finally, that I would like to address a little bit, that I think is very, very telling. Again, some of you may have heard of this. Are people here familiar with the Open Hillel movement? And what's going on at Swarthmore Hillel and Al Vassar? So, briefly, Hillel International, which is the umbrella organization for all Hillels, Hillel being the Jewish campus address, university campuses for Jewish students. And in fact, when I went to UCLA, I was very involved in my Hillel, and I was actually co-chair of the Israel Action Committee. I'll come clean. I was just telling Off, like 2 weeks ago, I went back to LA to visit my folks, and it was right around the time a divestment resolution was coming up, was being brought to the student council at UCLA, and SJP there asked me to visit with some of the student council members, which I did, and I just remember thinking, boy, I've come a long way. And it was a very powerful, profound moment for me to be back in my school and to see, as a rabbi now, and to see myself still involved in activism, but in such a, and for many of the same reasons, but just in such a radically different way. I think in some ways that represents the shift. At any rate, Hillel International came out with guidelines, as they called them, for programming, Israel programming on college, on all of their Hillels across North America, across the world actually. And one of the guidelines basically said that any group that sponsors or endorses BDS cannot be part of Hillel, cannot rent space at Hillel, cannot speak at Hillel, cannot be affiliated in any way with Hillel. And so basically what that means is that Jewish students on campuses have no way of interfacing with Palestinian students because just about every Palestinian student on college campuses are involved in some way or support in some way BDS. And there's frankly many Jews who are involved with BDS campaigns as well. So there was a group first at Harvard called the Progressive Jewish Alliance who reacted to this guideline, and it eventually moved into an independent organization called Open Hillel that basically was calling for an inclusive policy on Hillels across the country. That Hillel is supposed to be, according to its mission, the umbrella organization for the wide tent that is the Jewish community, the Jewish campus community. And by having a guideline like this, you are lopping off an important part of the Jewish constituency. And so basically saying that all should be welcome, whether they are Zionists, whether they are non-Zionists, whether they're anti-Zionists, whether they're post-Zionist, whatever, all should be welcome in Hillel. And then this last December, Swarthmore Hillel, the student government, the student board of Swarthmore Hillel, unanimously voted themselves an Open Hillel. And in their statement that accompanied their resolution, specifically said, we welcome all, including anti-Zionists. And Hillel International freaked out and said, you can't do this, you can't use Hillel's name. They came down really hard. They tried to squash Swarthmore, this tiny little, relatively tiny, comparatively, Hillel, who have absolutely stood firm. One of the reasons they were able to is that Swarthmore is a little bit unique in that they don't get any money from major Jewish establishment organizations like Jewish federations. They have an independent endowment. And that allows them to basically say, we're going to do what we do. And this was unanimous. What was even more telling was that with all of the criticism coming down from Hillel, that there were many in the Jewish community who were coming to the support of Swarthmore, including many liberal Zionists. And you might have read some of these articles that were written, including in what I would consider fairly mainstream publications like the New Republic, people who were Zionists, people like Peter Beinart and others, who were very anti-BDS and very pro-Zionist, but basically saying, you can't deny these people a place in the community. This is wrong. And the fact that Zionists are defending the right of anti-Zionist Jews to be part of the conversation is huge. That really shows that the pendulum is swinging back, and I don't think it can be stopped, quite frankly. I think it's going to gather momentum. Vassar Hillel just recently declared itself an open Hillel. You're going to see more, especially I think at some of the smaller liberal arts colleges around the country. But again, all this to me is a bellwether that what used to be considered a sort of a pariah dissenting voice is now moving into the conversation. And I think many of the old assumptions are being set aside, and I think we're seeing a transformation in our community. And I think, and I'll end with this, I think it goes hand in hand with the rise of the BDS movement and the Palestinian solidarity movement. There are many people like myself and colleagues of mine who are rabbis and just lay people who are joining this movement because we're part of that momentum. We see ourselves as part of that momentum. It doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight, and it doesn't mean there's not going to be ferocious pushback from the Jewish establishment. And what I would only say to that is that the more ferocious the pushback, the more you know it's succeeding. And if you're involved with SJP, you know that better than me. The divestment bill at UCLA did not pass. It was voted down 7-5. And I found out about that after I got back home, and I got emails from some of the students who I thought would be devastated, and they were like, no, we're building a movement. We've made it so much, we gained so many more adherents in this campaign and heard so many inspiring things said at the open mic part of the meeting that, that they see that time is we see that time is on their side. I would just end by saying that whenever we focus on the attacks and are tempted to be discouraged by them, I think we need to take a step back and realize that the rise in the hysteria of these attacks is in direct proportion to the success of the movement that we're a part of. So I'll stop there. There's much more to say. I'm happy if you have questions or comments, and we can go. I think we have the room until 9 o'clock.
Yeah, we have until whatever we want.
All right.
I think I speak on behalf of all of the UIUC campus and campaigner band. Thank you so much for coming on and delivering that lecture. So I guess now is the portion, the discussion portion. I would request that you guys go one at a time and raise your hand. And also, whenever you state your question, since we don't have mics rotating, make sure that the audience and Rabbi Rosen can hear you. So we'll begin with whoever wants to volunteer. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I should begin by saying that I'm actually neither Palestinian nor Jewish nor Muslim. I'm a Hindu guy from India. Ethnically, and I'm very sympathetic to your criticism of partition, because I come from a country which has been partitioned, and I know the trauma that it causes and the moral evil that it represents. That being said, one concern that I have about the one-state solution is that something that many people say is that unlike, say, in South Africa, where there was Nelson Mandela who prevented kind of blowback from taking place, there is no Palestinian Mandela. This is often said. And one could also look at the example of Zimbabwe, where after, where there wasn't a Mandela, and the whites in Zimbabwe were very badly attacked and persecuted after independence. So you give the example of, in this country, the fact that whites will be a minority in some, say, 20 or 30 decades, 2 or 3 decades time from now, for people like me and people of color, Latinos, blacks, and so forth, that doesn't create a panic. But why should that create a panic in Israel? Isn't it the case that there is from 1948 onwards, there has been such a history of unity, and given the absence of a Mandela-like figure, would the two communities, however much desirable it might be to be a binational state and for everyone to have equal rights, is it, from a pragmatic point of view, feasible?
Right, that's an excellent question. Did everybody hear the question? The question was, he's sympathetic to many of the things I said about partition and the two-state solution. However, a potential problem with the one-state solution is that in comparison to, say, South Africa, there was a Nelson Mandela who was able to reconcile the country and prevent a bloodbath after the fall of apartheid, and where there's no comparable figure in Palestine. And how can we envision, logically speaking, that kind of a coming together in a one-state solution, absent one unified figure such as him? I think the importance of individual charismatic leaders is shouldn't be underestimated, but I don't think it all hinges on that either. I think we need to take a very hard look at the reality of the status quo on the ground and think seriously about what are the political solutions that are going to move us forward, and what are the political solutions, on the other hand, that will just lead to continued bloodshed. Right now, we're at the 60-plus years of constant war. And the peace process, as I understand it now, is not about two states. I think the Palestinian state that's being envisioned in the current peace process does not resemble any viable contiguous state that any of us would recognize as a state. So, at this point, I am supportive of any solution that will allow for full democracy for everybody who lives in the land, full civil rights for all. If we can come up with some kind of two-state solution that would work along those lines, frankly, I would support anything that is put together by the actual stakeholders in this situation. It's not for me to dictate whether one state or two state. The issue of leadership, is an important one, but that shouldn't be the issue that stymies us from moving forward and seeking creative, forward-thinking, outside-the-box solutions to what has been suggested up until now. I will say also that in my travels in the West Bank, it's true there is no one necessarily comparable to a Mandela, but in the popular resistance, there are enormously principled, impressive, courageous Palestinian leaders. They may not be unifying an entire people, but I think it's always a bit of a canard to say, where are the Palestinian Gandhis, where are the Palestinian kings? I think if you look at the popular resistance, there's an enormous amount of creative leadership going on that we need to pay attention to and certainly not be dismissive of. You want to call?
Yeah, I'll just go in the order that I saw them, so excuse me if I'm wrong. Go ahead.
I'm so happy to see you here, Rabbi Rosen. I hope you will come back many times. There are progressive Jews down here, but we don't have a rabbi. So maybe you could, think of us as your extended congregation. I wanted to ask you about a particular thing that seems to be very timely now. I'm talking about BDS and the backlash to BDS. As you know, there's now a bill in the Illinois legislature which is part of the backlash of the American Studies Association, to punish universities who participate in professional associations that adopt BDS resolution. And that would mean, if this bill became law, that the University of Illinois could be punished by the state if, for example, a university faculty participate in the American Studies Association Code of Conduct. So I wondered if you might take advantage of that. Here you are, someone from Chicago, speaking to people in Champaign-Urbana at the University of Illinois. You might speak to that issue and
Yeah,
what's
well,
going
we
on.
need to be mobilizing big time, and I understand that you are to some extent, right?
Yeah.
Peter Rossman needs to hear from us, all of us. And this is, Illinois is not the only state, by the way, that's considered. Maryland is considering a similar bill as well. They're nuts. I mean, these bills are absolutely insane. But unless we raise awareness about them and take them very, very seriously, we can't just dismiss them by saying they're crackpot. I do believe that this is part of what I was talking about before about the historical response. They're sort of grasping at straws. But unless we're vigilant and we engage in the kind of advocacy that we need to engage in and letting these representatives know, people like Roscoe, how we feel, how the people feel, I think that kind of complacency could lead to something very dark. So, I mean, I can't, for the life of me, imagine it passing, but the only way it's not going to pass is if these representatives hear from us.
So, I mean, the entire topic of lectures is set within the American Jewish community, mainly in Chicago, but also in LA and other parts of the US. But in Israel, I mean, you have, a political figure like, Netanyahu who's pretty conservative. And you obviously you've been to Israel a lot. What's the situation like there? Like, is it becoming more progressive, or has it sort of been stagnant over the past few years?
That's a great question. Do people hear it?
Yes.
What's the situation in Israel? We've talked about the situation in the community here, but you see an conservative. I wouldn't even call Netanyahu ultra-conservative anymore. There are those who are people like Bennett and Lieberman who are even more ultra than him. What about them? What's the status there? Israel is moving politically to the right. There's no question. When you look at the results of the elections and the coalitions that have put together the last several years, if you read a book like Max Blumenthal's book, Goliath, you can really understand. I think he does a masterful job of showing just on the ground the level of racism that has become part of the fabric of Israeli life. And not only on the ultra-conservative side. I think there are progressive Jews in Israel, there's no question. Many of them are my friends, and I talk to them. And we used to march in the peace rallies together. And the peace movement in Israel is just languishing. It's just demoralized. It's pretty much non-existent, and it has very little political power whatsoever. And many progressive Jews are leaving. Many of them are moving to Europe. Actually, many of them are moving to places like Spain and Germany. There's a huge and growing Israeli population in Berlin. There's actually a Hebrew language radio station in Berlin. There's tens of thousands of Israelis who live there, which is just, I understand it. If you're progressive, you can only live, in a country like this for so long, and when your children go into the army, and there's a fatigue that sets in. What happens is they're leaving, and they're leaving behind the more conservative, more nationalist, more ultra-religious elements to stay. Those who are staying, I just think, are demoralized and have very little political clout. They just want peace and quiet, is my sense. And this is anecdotal, but I think there's something to it. I'll give you an example. I have many friends. When I considered moving to Israel, I had many friends who actually did. They actually moved to a kibbutz, different kibbutzim actually, and then ended up moving to the city and raising their families there. And these were very dear friends of mine once upon a time, and I still keep in touch with many of them. And since I've been involved in this activism, I'm very, very concerned about it. I'm not as in touch with them as I used to be, because I'm conflict avoidant in that respect with my friendships. So recently, right after I got back actually from my latest trip to the West Bank, and I wrote about marching and Palestinian solidarity rallies in the West Bank, etc. One of my dearest friends who lives in Tel Aviv, who's very progressive politically, was moving to Evanston, coming to Evanston for work, and said, "Oh, we haven't seen each other in a long time. Let's meet." And we met in the lobby of the hotel where he was staying, and we were talking and just sharing small talk. And I was dreading hearing what he would say. And he finally said, "I read your blog all the time." I said, "Oh, And he said, yeah, I read about your experiences in the West. I said, oh, and he said, I just want you to know I'm very proud of what you're doing. And it was so interesting psychologically. He said, if I stayed in the States, I might be doing the same thing as you, but Israel's my home now, and he didn't pretty much say it, but what I took away from this is he's sort of stuck. He lives there, his kids live there. He just wants peace and quiet. He wants his kids to live a nice, quiet existence, and, in Tel Aviv. He wants to be able to sit in his apartment in Tel Aviv and just not think about a few kilometers down the road that there's this place called Gaza, which is one of the biggest hellholes on earth. Literally just a few miles away from where he's sipping his cappuccino, And I think that's sort of an Israeli mentality of certain kinds of Israelis. They're very progressive, but they're tired of marching. They don't see any change. In fact, they see the change moving the other direction, and they're exhausted. There's fatigue setting in. And I think that's the direction, ominously, that the country's going. And I would say that, for me, I don't see my work as being about trying to win over the hearts and minds of Israelis. I think that's a waste of time, actually. I think whatever solution happens, it's going to have to be imposed on them. It's not going to come from them. I don't think they have the wherewithal to come up with a solution. I think the progressives are paralyzed, the ultranationalists and the religious are gaining in strength, and it's going to have to be the world that tells them to stop the way it happened in South Africa, which is why I'm throwing in the BDS movement and not, say, with a group like J Street that's talking about a political solution. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, question.
I'd like to offer another opinion about Israelis. Number one is that there have been many organizations since 48, with Hannah Arendt, but after Hannah Arendt, people who lived there. And so there are many organizations. There was also Matzpen. There was, I know.
No,
And for example, and the people went to jail. There was also not only Shalom Mashal, but also Yeshivut. And there were people like Uri Avneri, Shemunim, and they are still alive and keep the Shalom. Right. And there are people like Yossi Sarid, Shulamit Aloni, who passed away a week ago. And we are all languishing, but last week, for the 9th anniversary of Bil'in, there were people from Israel who went there to march and were shot by Israeli soldiers. You can see it in a clip. So to describe the peace movement in Israel as languishing, I think that it's not accurate. The best example is the letter that 50 high school students sent yesterday to Netanyahu, saying they refused, based on their conscientious stand, to serve in the military that supports the occupation, and they have a whole list of prisons. That's, I think, a voice for peace. That's the second. I would like to hear people like you speaking about those people much more, loudly, and not describe them only as languishing, because these people represent also, there's a lot at stake for those people as far as their lives, their careers, and they are doing something. And we should encourage them. When we say there is no Palestinian Mandela, well, there is also no Palestinian Uri Avneri. So the question that I'm posing to people who are for Palestine, if there would be people in Palestine with whom there can be a dialogue, with whom is Avneri or someone here going to talk? With whom? There are no comparable people who are on the conscientious stand, standing up to what is happening in the Palestinian society that's not one. There is no some parallel like that. But that's not the point. The point is, how are we really encouraging a dialogue? The Hillel thing is a good beginning, but we should encourage also dialogues, in Champaign-Urbana and in Palestine.
You bring up some very important points, and I have very close relationships with many the kinds of Israeli solidarity activists that you talk about, like Jeff Halper, people like Jonathan Shapira and others. And I don't want to in any way create the impression that these people don't exist and that they're not important. But I think many of these Israeli solidarity activists, absolutely need our support. But they truly understand that it's about more than just themselves. They're part of a larger movement that transcends Israel itself, right? And they put their lives on the line in very important ways, but I think it's very, very important at the end of the day to reckon with the power imbalance. You know, when you say, the one thing that you said that I don't completely agree with is that there's no Palestinian or Yavneri. A statement like that presumes a level playing field, that you have one person like this on one side, one person like this on the other side. But Israel is the country with the power in this situation. You know, someone like Uri Aveneri can only exist within a country like Israel. There are many very, very brave and important Palestinian human rights leaders and popular resistance leaders, people like Rabbi Brant Rosen. You know, I'm sure there are people in this room who could mention more than I. But to say that there's no one to talk to at all, I think is not true. I was just traveling throughout the West Bank, meeting with lots of members of the popular resistance who were sitting right next to Israeli solidarity leaders themselves, and but saw themselves ultimately as part of a larger movement, not just about a movement to save Israel's soul, but a movement for justice for everyone. And I think that's the important difference.
I'm so glad to be wrong.
So before we move on, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for sharing the story of your journey. Your personal journey is not easy, so I'm sure everyone appreciates that. And first of all, you know, one is just a shortcoming. A lot of those people who can talk with, you know, Uri Aveneri, they're in prison. And as soon as there is a leader who is basically coming to dominate the movement, then they are snatched out and then they languish in prison. So that's another reason why we don't see so many leaders on the Palestinian side, rather than the official guys who are on the pay of Israel. But my main question is a practical question, and it has to do with the way people who are for justice in the region and peace, how can we, I consider myself one of the, you know, the people like that, how can we open up a channel for dialogue with the synagogue here or with the Hillel? Of course, you know, my observations are limited as far as time is concerned to many months ago, because the rabbi of the Hillel and the rabbi of the synagogue, they have changed. There are new people. Right. So what I'm saying does not extend to these two people. But up to very recently, there was not a possibility of having a real dialogue, a real discussion. Everything would end in one-side-labeling, basically, and you know those labels. Right. And that's the end of it, something that can be a discussion. How can one start kind of scratching, you know, opening a tunnel or a channel of discussion? That's my main question.
Right. Did everybody hear the question? So, in terms of my own approach, I don't see dialogue as the most primarily important thing, to be honest. When you have limited time and resources and energy, I have found that dialogue for the sake of dialogue is a bit of a dead end, because you ultimately reach a certain place, you can't go farther than that, and then where do you go? And I think, again, there's a power imbalance in the Jewish community, and that the Jewish establishment, which is enormously, you know, are great resources at their disposal. Their approach is that they're not so interested in dialogue. You know, I mean, Hillel's approach to the open Hillel movement is not one in which we're saying, okay, let's come to the table and talk. We don't want to squash these open Hillels. So And so for me, I see that in the limited time and energy that I have, and the time that I have left, I would rather participate in a movement for justice than trying to find some kind of dialogue with my own community. If they're genuine about talking, I'm willing to talk. But I'm not going to spend all my time talking in circles when there's oppression on the ground right now that needs to be protested and needs to be addressed. And I know that sounds harsh because everybody's for dialogue, right? But if dialogue is only for the sake of dialogue, which is ultimately about just continuing an oppressive status quo, then I think we're part of the problem and not the solution. And after a certain point, the talking has to stop and the justice has to start.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, I think that had anything to do with dialogue, but since you're a rabbi, I was wondering, I know that there's a good amount of rabbis that say that Zionism contradicts the fundamentals of Judaism. Can you explain the argument that says Zionism contradicts Judaism, and can you explain the counter-argument that, I guess that Jews are now following?
There are different arguments, Jewish arguments that are put forth as to why Zionism is not part of traditional Judaism. The religious, the Orthodox traditional approach would be that, as I said before, you don't establish a Jewish state on your own. You wait for the Messiah to come. The Messiah does that. That until such time as that happens, we don't play God. We live as best we can in Galut, in the diaspora, throughout the world, and we're waiting for the Messiah to come to in the sort of mythic end of days time. And there's lots of discussions in the Talmud that say that look at the attempts to these nationalist movements in the past, the Bar Kokhba Rebellion and others, that ended up with in huge tragedy and upheaval for the Jewish community. The rabbis were very almost quietistic in a way. They were saying, you don't make waves. Live quietly in the galut, and the Messiah will take care of everything. There's another, I think, approach that would say that Judaism is never been about venerating human power, but recognizing that there is a power even greater than all human power, and that Judaism emerged, as I said before, after the destruction of the temple, when the Romans basically destroyed the temple and decimated the Jewish community. The rabbis realized that there's even a power greater than Rome, and that someday Rome will fall too. And it's not by night and not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts, according to Zechariah and the prophets. And that is a very powerfully Jewish value, powerful Jewish value, that we don't put our faith in human power, we put our faith in a power even greater than human power, that all empires will eventually fall. And look what happened to Rome, all right? They're in the history books, the Jewish people are still here. There must be something to that, right? There must be something to seeing the veneration of human power is almost a kind of idolatry in a way. And you see discussions of that over and over in Jewish tradition. Now, a Zionist would come and say, well, that's all well and good, but look how the Jews have been treated, to say we should live comfortably in the diaspora. Well, we haven't lived comfortably in the diaspora, right? We've been kicked out of all countries left and right over the centuries. We've been persecuted. We've been treated as second-class citizens. We've been disempowered. And it's all well and good to say that there's a power greater than human power, but in the meantime, human power and empires are wielding their power against us. And Zionism, in many ways, arose to say, we need power of our own. We need an empowerment movement, a political empowerment movement, which would end up being Zionism, so that we can safeguard the well-being of the Jewish people. And that is the argument for reintroducing nation-statism into Jewish life. Then there could be counter-arguments to that would say, yes, but it creates as many problems as it solves, because today, the only place in the world, really, where Jews are under a constant threat of attack communally is Israel, the place that was created to ostensibly safeguard the well-being of Jewish people. So, I think you can go back and forth with these arguments. Judaism has always been a very wide spectrum of movements and ideas and beliefs and values. There's no one monolithic belief in Judaism. And I wouldn't, Zionism has become a very important part of Jewish life. I don't deny that. I'm just questioning whether or not it was, whether it was kind of a Faustian bargain, to be honest, in the long run. That it seemed like a really good idea at the time, especially post-Holocaust and the trauma of the post-Holocaust. I don't underestimate what that must have been like for a second, and the redemptive nature of the Jewish statehood after the Holocaust. But it was a reaction to one trauma, but in many ways it's created a whole new trauma. I think Israel is a traumatized society that's having a hard time pulling itself out of that. So, there are arguments and counter arguments to be made. I think at the end of the day, we need to think about what are the Jewish, as a Jew, I want to think about what are the Jewish values that I consider the most sacrosanct. To me, I would say the values such as all human beings are made in the image of God, that the land belongs to God and we're strangers on that land, as it says in Leviticus, that land doesn't belong to people, and that there is sort of an idolatry that happens when we have a sense of entitlement to land. Also, as a pragmatist, I try to look at what are the solutions that are going to lead to a peaceful and just solution, and not just cycle back on themselves. Thank you.
I wonder if you could comment on what you see the potential of international law and the United Nations and other efforts at international organizations playing a role in all that.
I think the struggle increasingly, the Palestinian struggle has increasingly been recourse to international law, and more, I think we've been seeing a shift from the Palestinian movement being a national liberation movement to being more of a rights-based approach. And I think much of the success in recent years of the movement is largely due to that a human rights approach and an international law approach brings people in, right? I mean, as a Jew, I think I could safely say that if the Palestinian movement was only about Palestinian liberation, which is important, but all nationalist movements, whether it was a Zionist movement or any other movement, ultimately has a relatively narrow focus. But if it's a rights-based approach, which is about human rights, which is a universalist, the rights that we all share, that we all believe in, I think it's more compelling and actually more pragmatic. So I think that shift is one of the reasons why we're seeing the movement succeeding in the ways that it has. Whether or not international bodies will, live up to their mission, I think remains to be seen, because the UN is certainly a flawed institution. There's no question, and that's sort of the realm of the realpolitik on the ground. But I think increasingly we're going to see recourse to things like the International Criminal Court and different bodies of the United Nations, etc., because the political arena has been just so paralyzed for Palestinians.
I'm interested in what you would say about the growing influence, if it is growing, of Jewish white parties, for example, with congressional representatives. What's happening there, for example? Are you hopeful? Can you get to speak to Congress people, and will they listen to you?
Right. JVP doesn't define, is different from a group like J Street in that respect, where it really sees its role primarily as a political advocacy organization. And they, when I was involved in J Street and Reed Tzedek, I would go on those Capitol junkets and visit Congress people. And I think when it comes to the peace process, JVP is not putting its emphasis on trying to move the peace process forward the way J Street is, for instance. So we don't politically engage.
For military.
For military aid, for things like the ASA boycott resolution, for other kinds of political bills and things like that, absolutely. I think we pick and choose the areas in which we're going to engage politically, depending on whether we see them as strategically important. But I don't think we're primarily a political advocacy organization quite in the way that Bay Street or AIPAC are. That they see their work largely as taking place on Capitol Hill. We're very much part of the popular movement, the BDS movement, and a human rights movement, just as much, if not more so.
So I thought of a bunch of different things as people have asked different questions, and so hopefully I can frame this in a coherent way. But as an Arab Israeli / Palestinian citizen of Israel, I can't help but think of whether you make a distinction in terms of rights and things between Palestinians in the territories and Palestinians in Israel. I do appreciate that you are not necessarily arguing for a one-state versus two-state solution, because it is complicated, and I do agree with you that ultimately it's about rights. But I was thinking about what you said about just having this imposed on Israel in a way because it's not going to come from them, and I do feel that it's not likely to come from them. But how do you feel about the current situation in Israel for Palestinians, Arab Israelis? Would you say that Arab Israelis already have enough rights? Because this is something that I always have to explain to people. Yes, we do have all the rights. You know, I wouldn't even add any qualifiers to that, because we do. We can work in Israel, we can vote, we can do whatever we want. But in reality, there's a lot of discrimination, and you know, it's not an institutionalized form of discrimination, but it does happen. And so my thinking about that is that if anything is going to change about that, then it kind of does have to come from the people, right? So what would be a practical way to try to bring about change in that area?
So there's a few things I think to tease apart some of the parts of your question. The first part, I guess, is the issue of the imposed solution. And maybe I wasn't precise enough. When I say imposed solution, obviously, ultimately the solution will have to be one that comes from the people who are living in that country. You know, and I would compare it to South Africa, for instance, or even the civil rights movement in this country, that ultimately reform did come from within. But when I say imposed, I meant there was in both cases there were popular movements that were pushing from the outside, creating the kind of pressure so that the political reality inside had to shift to such a point that a paradigm shifted, right? So that's what I mean when I say imposed. I don't mean that the people inside have absolutely no say, but that, you know, in the Jim Crow South, there was institutional, and I think I would actually compare the lot of Palestinians in citizens of Israel to Jim Crow in many ways. I think I would call it institutional discrimination in many cases. I think they're second-class citizens. You're non-Jewish citizens of a Jewish state.
That's true.
You know, I've often heard it described, you know, the differences between Palestinian citizens of Israel as living in Jim Crow South as opposed to those in the West Bank who are living sort of under South African apartheid more. And then we have Palestinians who are refugees who are having a completely, you know, a different status. And even among the refugees, there are different, you know, levels as well. So you can't generalize, and I don't mean to do that. But I would say that, you know, when you look at the civil rights movement in this country, for instance, right, you had an entrenched power elite in the South that they were not going to reform themselves, right? You know, it's like Frederick Douglass said, you know, power concedes nothing without a demand, it never did, it never will, right? Never in human history has a powerful regime woken up one day and said, you know, I think we're going to give up our power because it's the right thing to do. Because the way power concedes is when they are pushed to do so. And in the case of the South, you had a huge popular movement that was growing in strength, that was creating coalitions that were, beating down the politician's door, basically, saying, this has to change. And when Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, he didn't, he did it because he reached a political state of mind where he felt he could do this, right? And he was pushed to do it and found the wherewithal to do it. But he didn't do it out of the goodness of his heart, And I think it was the same with de Klerk in South Africa. And so that's what I mean when I say imposed from without. I don't mean that the people on the ground have no say in it. And here's a case where I do think that Israelis, like Rui Avineri and other peace activists will ultimately be very, very important and play a very critical role. But right now, at least for me, and it sounds a little draconian to say it, but I think for me the emphasis right now has to be on the external pressure and not trying to win over hearts and minds inside. I'll just end by saying when Mandela died, I was so struck, and maybe you were too, that so much of the press that was written about him after his death was about Mandela, the reconciler, and Mandela, the person who brought people together, and reconciliation. And there was relatively little about the fact that he was a freedom fighter. He was considered a terrorist by this country until, well into the 2000s. And to me, that was instructive because before you have reconciliation, you have to have justice. And he was, I think, such an unprecedented person that he was able to be both. I think very few leaders can be both the freedom fighter and the reconciler. I think that was his genius. His gift to all of us, because he was able to make that change. When you say where the Palestinian Mandela, I don't know where there are any Mandelas, to be honest. I think he was in many ways a miraculous individual. I don't know that we could point to, I don't think Castro, for instance, was a reconciler by any means. I think different leaders have different skill sets and different moments in time that are important. So, to me, after Mandela died, I realized that sort of the way justice happens is that first you have to have liberation, you have to have justice. Reconciliation can only happen after that. To talk about reconciliation before we have justice, I think just prolongs the oppression.
We have a question over there, then here, and there. So
I definitely agree with what you're saying, how the situation really is stagnant, because I also recently read an article about a journalist going to Israel, and he mentioned that he doesn't really see a Palestinian-Israeli conflict because all he sees is an oppressor oppressing the citizens. And Goliath as well, I'm reading that right now, and it really is surprising to see the amount of racism and hatred even towards the Arabs. And so with such a stagnant society, it makes sense that you need external pressure, but I kind of feel like in this day and age, I don't know how much more pressure is necessary to really cause a change on the ground. In the past, whenever Israel has entered into Gaza, all I really remember is the UN saying, oh, we urge you to leave, and no real action taking place. And with the United States, with such strong Israeli lobbying, there's really nothing that's really happening on the ground to change anything. And it does seem like BDS is doing something, because Netanyahu coming in and actually speaking so vehemently against it shows that I guess at least we're getting under their skin in that sense. But what more? Is there really? Can we really do enough on the outside to change it on the inside? Is there really more that we can do, or is it really going to have to take something from within with outside help to actually create a difference?
I think eventually there will be, from within will be important, but right now, I'll put it even more strongly. If you look at South Africa and the way things happen in South Africa, and I think it's instructive. South Africa was isolated internationally so much that they had to change. And the reason they were isolated was there was a huge popular movement internationally that was